Thanks everybody for joining us this evening. Yeah, this is a little bit different than the plant ID ones. Obviously, we're going to be talking about a topic that's, I think, really important if you plan to do any prescribed burning. Because if you plan to burn, you should have some idea of what might happen. And again, sort of the end of this presentation, we'll talk more about the importance of that in terms of what you want to try to accomplish. But before we get to that, just some other general stuff about fire ecology, a little bit more about how it affects things. So I'll share my screen and we'll get started. Got a frog in my throat. There we go. So everyone can hear me, right? We're ready to go. All right, so I put this diagram on more or less just to convey the idea that fire is complex. This is supposed to be kind of like a visual model of what all can happen. And I don't think it even has everything that can happen, but at least an attempt to show a visual picture that gives you some idea of all the many myriads of things that are connected and things that can happen when fire does occur. And we'll be touching on many of these things, but again, the idea here is simply that it's a very complex thing. And so again, knowing at least a little bit about it is going to be a big help if you want to apply fire to any of the land management that you're doing. So what we're going to talk about, why is this not working? There we go. Here's some of the questions that we'll take a look at this evening. Try to address most of these. So the first part of this is looking at the first question really about the importance of fire as an environmental factor. And I'm talking about broadly the environment. We're going to focus, of course, on natural environments, but we can even think a little bit about, human environments too. And this slide is meant to kind of convey that with the amount of cost that is, it's continuing to go up year after year. This goes up to 2015 in terms of the cost that our government and our states expend on fighting wildfires. They're getting more expensive to fight, of course, because of just the general cost, but they're also getting more expensive to fight because of climate change, differences in fuel, and probably some differences in landscape. And also, I would say probably also just the urban fire interface is becoming more and more common. We can think about, the idea that some of this cost, of course, is involved in the tremendous amount of structures that are destroyed. California wildfires in 2020, 6,000 homes, lots and lots of structures. Unfortunately, of course, many deaths as well. 130 billion, 150 billion in financial impacts there. That again is huge. So the point here again is that fire, whether it's wildfires, what we're talking about here, but prescribed fire has the potential to become wildfire, of course, if things go wrong. Wildfire is a very important aspect of our landscapes and where we live. I keep thinking that, one of the problems is we don't have enough, I guess, forethought of thinking about where people choose to live and where they build homes. It's kind of the same idea that, if you're going to build your house on a floodplain, a lot of people would tell that person, well, if you're going to build your house on a floodplain, you should have to pay for your own cost in fixing or replacing your house when it floods, because a floodplain means it's going to flood. Rather than society, of course, having to pay for it through the flood insurance. In the same way, we could talk about, again, people building homes in fire-prone environments. Fire-prone environments are the same kind of thing as a floodplain. You can be pretty sure that a fire is going to come along at some point. So we all saw the news, certainly with the fires that were out west. 2020 was a big year for fires, as you can see here in this little blurb here with the number of firefighters that were out there, the number of fires that were active, number of acres that were burned. A very big year for fires. In fact, we'll take a look at some of the fires that were in Colorado. So you've seen some of these pictures probably again from, this is actually from 2017. So this was the, let's see, Tubbs fire, I guess it is. Yeah, Tubbs fire. I remember hearing about that one. The tremendous, again, damage that was done to humans and human possessions here. This one in 2018, Camp Fire, which was in the news for a long time. Oh yeah, remember the Australian fires in 2019 and 2020? Of course, their summer season is opposite of ours, so it was winter here, December and January, February. Tremendous amount of fire activity down there. The bushfires burned more than 46 million acres, 72,000 square miles. 3,500 homes were destroyed, along with thousands of other built buildings. 34 people lost their lives in those fires. And here's the one about the Colorado fires in 2020, October of 2020. I remember this. My son lives in Parker, Colorado, just south of Denver, and he was, giving us some info about the fires. And as of October of 2020, Colorado had the 3 largest fires ever that they've ever had, all occurred in 2020. The Cameron Peak fire was the biggest of those. Some of them got fairly close to Boulder, I believe. This one was outside Estes Park. So the point here again is that fires, of course, are hugely important. Wildfires are hugely important, and having to get a knowledge of just fire behavior and fire ecology is all a better, is a part of having a better understanding, of course, how fire works and how perhaps some of this could be avoided. So this shows again the amount of acreage going up in terms of the size of fires and the amount of fires that occur from 1985 to almost 2020 there. Obviously, it is somewhat variation there because some years are more, some years are less. But we can see there is a fairly consistent line there that you try to smooth that curve out there a little bit. Fires consistently going up in terms of the size of them and the amount of burning that occurs. And that corresponds fairly well to this data right here, which is looking at the global temperatures as an anomaly from the, which means the amount below or above the average from 1951 to 1980. And there's those 5 different lines, there are 5 different sources for what those global temperatures are doing. And you can see all 5 of those lines, a little bit of variation in there, of course, because they're using slightly different data, but they all pretty much mirror each other in terms of, again, what's going on there with global temperatures. And of course, this is, this is observation. So you cannot make any kind of claims of cause and effect, but there's a very, very strong correlation between increasing global temperatures and increasing numbers of fires and the size of fires. Not surprising. This is some data that the TNC put together from an independent study that they did looking at sort of classifying landscapes in terms of the amount of degradation, as they're describing it here. And they have these 2 sort of orangish colors, light orange and dark orange, to represent ecosystems that are degraded or very degraded because of fire suppression. So here they're talking about that absence of fire, of course, on the landscape, which of course has been a part of our history for a long, long time, and what that has done to those systems. You can see that there's only a few places that are intact, meaning that there hasn't been much loss of biodiversity and structure and the way ecosystems work in those green areas. Mostly places that are somewhat fairly wild and probably has at least some kind of natural fire still occurring. But all through the Midwest, all through the South, very, very degraded to degraded. When you think about fire, I think the right way to think about it is it's a manifestation of climate, because it's all about climate in terms of where and when fire occurs. So when I say manifestation, it's just basically what I'm saying. It's an extension of climate. We can think about different climates that have a fire type of environment, have a fire climate. And the first factor there, of course, is the seasonality of precipitation, because you have to have this sort of a certain amount of variation in the precipitation that you're getting through a year or growing season. Have to have at least moderate amounts of precipitation to produce enough the amount of biomass, plant growth, in other words, to generate a fair amount of fuel. But then on the other hand, you also have to have seasonal drought, or basically times during the growing season or during the year when precipitation is much lower, so that the flammability of that litter is going to go up. You know, you don't have much of a fire environment or a fire climate in a desert, because there's just simply not enough precipitation to get the first part of that, the productivity, the formation of litter. And you don't have, much of a fire climate or environment in a temperate rainforest or tropical rainforest, because it's again, you don't have that dry period when the fuel becomes flammable. The other part of the climate is that meteorological ignition, because yeah, you get fuel, you have vegetation, dead plant growth that can burn, but now you have to ignite it somehow. And of course, the only natural way that happens is through lightning. So thunderstorm activity is paramount there. The more thunderstorm activity, the more lightning you are going to see, perhaps. Also, of course, it's kind of a tricky situation with the amount of rain that also is going to fall in a storm. We know that, again, water and fire don't mix very well. So you can have times during the growing season when you have a lot of lightning, but you're also going to have a lot of rain. And so that's not a particular time when natural fires would have been lit. The size and intensity of those storms is becoming more important as well. There's some indication that global warming, of course, is also increasing the frequency of lightning, so that lightning is becoming even more common than it normally is, which is pretty common, as you're going to see in just a little bit. And another thing to think about lightning is that, and it's kind of in conjunction with the juxtaposition of lightning and rain sort of occurring together, but it doesn't always necessarily have to be that way. Lightning can strike more than 10 miles away from any rainfall that's occurring. And so there is always a potential for lightning strikes to occur in portions of thunderstorm activity where there is little to no rain. Another important thing for you to remember, just basically for your own good and protection, is that because lightning can strike up to 10 miles away from where you think it's going to be because you're where it's raining, is that more than 50% of lightning-caused deaths occur after the storm has passed. When people think it's safe now to go out, the rain's over, the storm has passed. But again, lightning can still potentially strike up to 10 miles away. So here's a map that shows the seasonality of precipitation, basically. And what this is sort of a map of is the flammability of the vegetation. The flammability is increasing as we go from this blue color going up to the orange, red, and way up here towards the top, this really dark brown color. Because again, high seasonality indicates that there's times when it's wet, you get a lot of growth, but then there's also times when it's very dry and you get the flammability. So you can see across North America, good flammability all throughout the Midwest into the Great Plains here. Iowa's in the 50th to 60th percentile here. It quickly, very quickly, once you get west of or east of the Mississippi here, it gets pretty low. And obviously, if you know what the biomes of North America map looks like, this corresponds somewhat pretty well with, the tallgrass prairie in through here, and then the deciduous forest over here. There is the cause of ignition. Now, way back when fire first started occurring on Earth, over 400 million years ago, there would have been potential for lightning, of course, to start fires, but also probably some ignition from volcanic eruptions, maybe some possible fire ignition from when meteorites, strike to Earth. But lightning is clearly by far the much more important source, and pretty much the only source, of course, now. So how often, how common is lightning? I got a couple of maps here that shows two different versions of measuring lightning. One of them here is with satellites that NASA has. There's a couple of different satellites that have lightning detectors on them that they use it a couple of different things, but basically they use some high-speed cameras to try to detect the occurrence of lightning up higher in the atmosphere. And you see here, Iowa, I just circled Iowa in the Midwest right there with that dark circle right there. And looking at the scale on the right there, we see that basically we're seeing 10 to 20 flashes per kilometer square per year. Based on this NASA data, that means Iowa sees anywhere from 1.5 to 3 million lightning flashes per year. Now, the reason I'm trying to stress again the importance of the amount of lightning strikes is that, again, going back to thinking about when natural fires occurred, and that only occurs with lightning, the number of lightning strikes is very important because certainly a lot of lightning strikes occur in situations that ignition would not occur. But the more strikes there are, of course, and the more range in where those strikes are taking place is going to increase the potential for any one strike to start a fire. I'm not going to have time to get into the debate about lightning caused fire and Native American use of fire. Clearly, Native Americans utilize fire, have been using fire for a long time, and there's no doubt that that has had probably some effect on perhaps at least the timing of fires, maybe a little bit on the frequency of fires. But I will say that just because Native Americans use fire for many reasons and set fire, that does not mean that we still didn't have lightning caused fires, because if there's that many strikes, well, it's probably not quite that many, because again, this is a satellite data. This map is probably a little bit more accurate in terms of lightning that starts fires. This is a different type of detection network that's out there, the National Lightning Detection Network. This is considered to be a more accurate set of data, especially if you're talking about lightning strikes that start fires. That NASA data, that's going to record cloud-to-cloud lightning, any lightning, cloud to cloud, cloud to ground. This one can detect the difference between cloud to cloud and cloud to ground. And what we're looking at here is cloud to ground. Obviously, cloud to cloud, lightning doesn't start any fires. Cloud to ground is the lightning that's going to start a fire. So it drops down to less than half of what we had before, certainly, but still 500 to 900,000 lightning flashes per year over the state of Iowa. And if you think about 30 million acres of flammable litter, that's what Iowa had, of course, in terms of the amount of tallgrass prairie at the beginning of the 1800s, or even before, of course, when Native Americans were here. That's still a lot of flammable fuel out there. And so I have no doubt that lightning was still causing fires to occur, even though Native Americans were using fire as a tool. Again, with that many flashes per year, there would be a lot of potential. This next map is going to show us could get at the question of how often was fire occurring, perhaps again under natural fire regimes. This is a map that comes from a paper published in 2000. As you see there, wildland fire in ecosystems. It shows, of course, the lower 48 states there in different colors. And if you look at Iowa, we see those two colors standing out. And so the yellow color that you see across northern Iowa, these are called stand replacement fires occurring up to, well, they say 0, but basically 1 to 10 years in terms of how often. What we're looking at there is the fire return interval. So how long from one fire to the next time fire occurs on that same piece of land. And what we mean by stand replacement, of course, means that the entirety of the vegetation, pretty much, actually they use a percentage, they use 80%, but 80% or more of the above ground vegetation, dominant vegetation, is consumed by the fire or dies as a result of the fire. And what that means then is basically the community has to be replaced in its entirety, basically, because it has been consumed. On the other hand, the other side of Iowa, the southern half of Iowa, is in this blue color, which is understory fires under the same interval. And understory, of course, means these are fires that are non-lethal to the dominant vegetation, and this is going to be, of course, trees. So understory fires are surface fires that burn through savannas and woodlands and forests. So in Iowa, we're talking about, again, probably a return interval of at least no more than 10 years. I've seen some other maps that suggest, for Iowa, maybe 3 to 5 years or so. It's really difficult to say, of course, what that return interval was, because there's really no way to get good data on that in prairie landscapes, because prairies don't have trees that can record fire scars, and you can get that kind of data. You certainly can get fire scar data from places that have a higher amount of tree growth. Woodlands across the southern part of the state there, for example, would work. And I know there's been a lot of fire scar work done in Missouri. Now, what I want to show you here is that you can see that we've got, again, understory and mixed severity, and then stand replacement over here. And these are forest and woodland types, of course, as we said. Stand replacement, in a forest means the entire forest burns, of course. And you can see, that's something that does happen out in the west, of course, on some of those conifer forests. And they even show some stand replacement fires in through here, too. I'm not quite sure what forest system that is. Must be perhaps conifer forest again. But then they have some return intervals that are really, 200 or more years. These are going to be places where fire hardly ever occurs, where fire is not a very important factor of the environment. These are places that are, pretty much fire resistant. They have climates that are fire resistant, so fires don't occur there very much. And I'm going to just hatch those out to show you those are the places where fire doesn't hardly ever occur. I'll go back. And what I want you to see here is that most of the 48 states has a pretty important significance then in terms of fire. Because a large percentage of the land area here is not hatched out with those fire return intervals that are very, very long. So fire has always played a very important role in the vegetation across the United States and in the rest of North America. And that's been true for hundreds of millions of years. So the first evidence that wildland fires were occurring on Earth came in the Silurian. This is about 420 million years ago or so. And it corresponds, of course, to when land plants are starting to colonize the terrestrial environments. Vegetation is starting to become a dominant part of the landscapes, and so fuel is building up. You're not going to have, again, wildfires until you get something of substantial amount there, of course, to burn. So the slurring is when, again, land plants or plants began to colonize the land. The first slide here shows 5 different pieces of evidence. What paleobotanists find basically are charred plant remains. And that's what these all represent here. This very first one here is an early Devonian plant that, again, is about 400 million years ago. This rhinophytoid, that's basically a plant that looks a lot like equisetum. Excuse me. And then we have Pennsylvanian age. That's the age, time period, not the state. But Pennsylvania is 340 million years ago, a seed. And a Cretaceous fern. Cretaceous is about 100 million years ago. Triassic wood right here. Triassic is about 225 million years ago, and then a Cretaceous flower over here. And then this one here shows this plant called neurophyton. Neurophyton is in this group of plants called progymnosperms. So it was sort of a precursor to gymnosperms, which are the conifer trees. It's similar to gymnosperms in that it has wood. So it was making wood. It's going to be like a tree, but it's unlike gymnosperms in that it doesn't have seeds. It reproduces by spores like ferns do. But what we're seeing here actually is charred branches imprinted as a fossil here. So the point here again is that fire has been a very important factor on the Earth's surface for hundreds of millions of years. It's been shaping the vegetation on Earth. It's been shaping how organisms evolve on Earth, the plants, the animals that inhabit terrestrial systems. And it's also interesting to note that the intensity of fire varied quite a bit because the oxygen level in the atmosphere varied quite a bit. There were some times, primarily in the Carboniferous, that's about 325 million years ago. Also in the Permian, that's about 270 million years ago or so. In the Cretaceous, when oxygen levels were weren't double, but were quite a bit higher than they are now. They're up to almost 28%. Right now it's about 20%. But oxygen levels up to 28% meant that fires were much more common. And then there were other times when the oxygen level in the atmosphere was dropped down to below 20%, got down to 17 to 18%. So of course, the frequency of fire would have varied because of that. But it's important to, again, understand that fire has always been a tremendous factor on the Earth's surface, shaping what we have. So the fire regime is a concept we use to describe sort of the fire environment, the fire climate that again, is a characteristic of the climate. It's a manifestation of the climate. It's also a manifestation of the ecosystem and the vegetation type, which of course is also related to the climate. So climate affects this, as well as the climate and weather itself is affecting the presence of fire. Both of these together again, create this thing we call the fire regime, which is just sort of, again, the way fires typically occur on a landscape. And the typical fire regime characteristics are these 5 things we see here. So, of course, the frequency is how often fire occurs. That fire return interval, again, is how many years is it between natural fire burns a site and then returns again to the same site. Fuel consumption and fuel spread, of course, is mainly a factor of the vegetation type in terms of how much gets consumed and how fast fire moves. Season is going to be a very important one. That's why I circle it here. Seasonality, of course, is the timing of the fire. Frequency is also somewhat timing. Again, how often occurs relates to time, but seasonality also relates to time more from the standpoint of specifically during the calendar year, when does fire normally occur. Then intensity refers to the amount of energy that's released by the fire, the amount of heat basically. And so that kind of represents in how much damage or how much consumption can occur. Severity is a way of sort of translating that into something that firefighters use just to sort of get at how intense the fire was. the more intense the fire is, the more severe the outcome is. And I wanted to point out that fire, of course, has a very, very important role in vegetation dynamics, how vegetation changes across time. And so I'm using this double pointing arrow here to characterize again that this is a gradient, an environmental gradient going in both directions, of course. I'm using some terms here that describe the mechanism of vegetation dynamics. Disturbance is a situation when there's major amounts of vegetation change because there's dramatic impacts on the quantitative amount of plant species, so much that there's qualitative change. Species are lost and new species come in. That's what we call succession. And disturbance is what initiates that succession. If the amount of impact of a fire or any other kind of, well, it wouldn't be a disturbance, we call it perturbation. Perturbation is basically disturbance, but to a much lower magnitude. Again, that usually doesn't cause succession, that causes just some fluctuation in the vegetation. And then on the, and as you can see, we're talking about a negative feedback here in terms of again, effect on the vegetation, but you always have to think about negative and positive in some context, because fire, you know, depending upon what you're talking about, you can look at a fire effect as being a positive outcome, positive feedback. For example, if you get increased growth and increased nectar production, increased seeds, or you could think about fire having a negative feedback if what happens is you've got increased germination of invasive species. So again, that is always set in some context. So it's important to keep that in mind. But again, you can look at it going both ways. There can be no effect of fire. Basically, oscillation means that there's hardly any change at all. You can barely detect any kind of change. And again, of course, the fluctuation that occurs in the positive direction, we can think about that as stimulation. It's doing something that, again, we are viewing as a positive thing. All right, so this next section is going to look more closely at seasonality, because I think it's a really important thing to consider. And then this is, again, a really hard thing to figure out, because we've changed the landscape so dramatically that we cannot expect lightning fires to occur in Iowa anymore, because we don't have a flammable landscape. We've got an agricultural landscape. So where you can sort of get this is if you go a little bit to the west into the Great Plains, where they've still got rangeland, they've still got a lot of grassland. Rangeland is, of course, native prairie that's being used as pasture. And you can get some handles on when fire occurred, when lightning fires occurred. This work from this 1984 study, just showing again the numbers of fires here on the left. This is the number of lightning-caused fires. They're looking at 293 lightning-caused fires between this time period here, 41 to 82. And again, classifying them as to the month when those specific fires began, lightning-caused fires. Over here, it's the same data basically, but now we're looking at the monthly distribution of days with lightning-caused fires. And so we see there's 293 fires, there's 213 days. That, of course, means that there were some situations where there were multiple fires, of course, 2 or more fires going on the same day. But these show basically the same thing, of course. We can clearly see that July and August are the days when, or excuse me, the months when lightning-caused fires are much more likely to occur. It drops off considerably into September, probably because it drops off in terms of lightning activity, and thunderstorm activity starts to drop off. It drops off going the other direction in June, as you're going to see in this next slide, because of the amount of rainfall. This next study is a classic one done by Tom Bragg, who investigated lightning-caused fires in Nebraska. And there's quite a bit going on here, but we'll just pay attention to kind of what I'm pointing to. That top slide there, I can get that out of the way now. That top slide is just looking at the precipitation distribution of precipitation over the year. And, you know, again, we obviously get more rain, and Nebraska does too, in the months May, June, and July. April is usually pretty high in Iowa too. And then it drops off, of course, both directions. But what you need to look at more here is, again, the lightning caused fires. Lightning caused fires, again, compared to the precipitation. And here's the thunderstorm days. So the thunderstorm days, again, we can see the peak is a little bit to the left of the lightning caused fires. That's again because, again, we get a fair amount of lightning, mainly in May and June, but May and June have a lot more precipitation associated with those storms. So we don't have the situation where, again, an ignition can be very successful in causing a fire. But as you go into later summer, of course, into July and August here, again, July and August, different set of data, but the same outcome as the previous slide, July and August, that's the peak for lightning caused fires. We see, you know, a drop off in the amount of precipitation here. Here we go right here, especially with August, which is, again, going to help increase then the number of lightning caused fires. On the right-hand side here, just is showing again well, I would call this sort of, what this is actually showing, as I put right here, is the vegetation or fuel resistance to fire. He's looking at an old growth area, and by old growth, what he means here is an area that's not been burned. So an old growth area is a place where there hasn't been a fire, there's an accumulation of litter. A new growth area is a place that has been burned and the litter is gone. And what he's looking at here, a couple of graphs here. The top one is looking at the percent moisture. Basically, that's equivalent to the amount of green biomass present. And of course, in a burned area, that starts out really high because that's all there is. Litter is a very small part of that. In an area where there hasn't been any fire, the amount of green is much lower because there's a lot of litter there. And we start getting some, you know, again, green plant growth in May and June here. And this is looking at, again, then this idea of fuel resistance to fire. It's the inverse of flammability. And he's looking at, again, how much, he's looking at the juxtaposition of both of these areas. How much fuel is there? How much fuel, dry, dead litter is there? And also how much green growth is there? Because again, the combination of those two things are going to be a factor in terms of how flammable the vegetation is. When you have a lot of green and not very much litter, then the flammability is not very good because you can't burn green biomass very well. So the point here again is that when you look at this measure then of vegetation fuel resistance to fire, again, this is the inverse of flammability. Flammability is very low right here where this is a peak in June. You're not going to get a fire to go very well in June. The lightning wouldn't be able to get a fire to go very well in June. But look how much it drops off in July and August. Again, this going down means that flammability is going up dramatically here. So again, that's an explanation for, again, why July and August are the times when lightning caused fire would have been most likely to occur. All right, let's look at some of the effects on ecosystems now. So the first thing I want to point out is this is hugely important, I think. Fire is a hugely important agent of natural selection. Natural selection, of course, is how evolution works, is how things adapt. Natural selection means, of course, if you remember, it means that some individuals, organisms live to reproduce another day, increase the frequency of their alleles, genes in the population, especially into the future populations, a generation down the road at least. And some don't because they die. Natural selection means there's winners and losers. That's important because, again, that means that, again, fire has this very important role to play in evolution. It means that also, because it can kill things. Fire can kill things. It does kill things. And so what I'm saying here is basically effective fire management versus unintentional injury or death. I mean, again, this can be a positive or a negative thing. If you're using effective fire management, it's a positive thing because you're trying to kill the bad stuff that's not adapted for fire. If you're using fire in a haphazard way because you don't understand fire, then you could have this unintentional injury or death, which is a negative thing. It has this, again, very strong evolutionary perspective. And one of the most important ways, of course, is you see right here with this dead cedar, something I really enjoy seeing, and especially out in the Loess Hills. And that's because there's a dramatic difference between woody and herbaceous plants, of course, in how they have been able to adapt to fire. Woody plants have a much more difficult time adapting to fire. They have, here's a little description of the differences that are important here. Woody plants have primary and secondary growth. Primary growth is the growth that occurs to make a plant taller, to lengthen the shoot system and branches. Secondary growth is what makes the stem wider or thicker. And of course, woody plants have both of those. Herbaceous plants just have primary growth. So it's just, just the growth that they have in terms of elongating the shoots. Woody plants have a lot of lignin and a lot of cellulose, of course, to support a very big plant, a very big stem, a lot of weight, very rigid stem. Bark can be present, of course, to help provide some protection. This also makes woody plants not very good at dealing with high wind, such as we see in a derecho or a tornado, whereas herbaceous plants with that flexible stem, no problem. Woody plants are always perennial. Herbaceous plants can be any of these, of course, but the most important thing then is how are these plants perennial? And in woody plants, it's because of two things: that vascular cambium, which is the meristematic tissue that results in the plant getting thicker, the stem diameter getting larger. That's what adds, again, more growth to the diameter of the stem. And that's right underneath the bark. The way that it gets, the shoot system gets longer, of course, is through terminal and lateral buds that are out there on the branches. Both of these things are potentially, especially these buds, are very much exposed to the heat of flames. This vascular cambium can be exposed to the heat of flames if there's not very thick bark. Trees such as bur oak, of course, and a few other species have the thicker bark, which helps to protect that, and also the phloem tissue. But it's still in a pretty precarious position because it's just right underneath that bark. And so fire can really wreak havoc on woody plants because, again, both of these are the tissues that allow for the plant to keep growing, to stay alive and keep growing. And if they are hampered by heat or killed by heat, that means the tree is in a tough place, of course. It's probably not going to make it. Whereas in a herbaceous plant, all the perinating tissues, the tissues, again, which allow for the plant to come back year after year and be a perennial or an annual or biennial, when we talk about seeds, the rhizome, the corms, the bulbs, the roots, these are all below ground. And even seeds are below ground at one point as they get into the seed bank. And so these are all protected from the heat of flames by being in the soil. So again, there's a huge difference in the way that herbaceous plants can much more easily handle the stress of fire compared to a woody plant. So we're going to just review a few things here, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail on how some of these things work. But we classify the effects, either direct effects on the environment or indirect effects. And so the direct effects, these are the things that happen because of the actual fire, the oxidation of fuel, the heat that's produced because of the oxidation of fuel, the release of heat. So the removal of litter, the oxidation, and of course, the consumption of plants. The consequence of that, of course, is ash. And in the ash, we can see nutrients like calcium and potassium and magnesium. We also have the loss of nutrients, though, because as biomass is being burned and the heat is being produced, that's volatilizing nutrients like nitrogen, carbon, and sulfur. Those nutrients are volatilized off, and they're not retained. That's an important thing to consider about how often you burn, because it's been shown in research that if you burn annually, and it gets pretty consistent, you can actually be depleting the ecosystem of nitrogen. Not to say the amount of carbon too. And it can be some direct effects on the soil, again, because of the heating effect that can happen there. I'll just say that, under most situations in prescribed burns or wildfires in prairies, for example, or surface fires in woodland, there's not that much heating of the soil. So this is a very minor thing. Where this becomes important is if you start burning brush piles and you have a lot of fuel that sits, sitting in one place, and then you can get a lot of heat going down into the soil. Normally, that's not too much of an issue. Indirect effects then are the things that happen because of the direct effects, sort of second level consequences. And there's a lot of things that happen because of the removal of litter. Most of those are changes in the microenvironment, microclimate. We'll look at that a little bit more. But certainly, increased solar radiation because of the effect of the litter being gone now and direct exposure to sun. We'll talk about some things related to sun versus shade leaves. Precipitation is also going to be, again, an indirect effect because the litter's gone again. And we'll review that, how that is an important effect. And even wind and convective cooling can be an important factor that plants perceive, again, because, again, of the removal of the litter. So, again, most of these indirect effects are largely on the microclimate and microenvironment that results when the litter has been removed. Now, another important thing to say here probably would be that as we consume plants up here, the direct effect of just consuming plant material, consuming vegetation, there's a huge effect there in terms of the simplification of structure. You're simplifying the vegetation structure when that happens. And that can be a huge effect, of course, an indirect effect then on the animal life that is present, because if you change the structure of the vegetation in significant ways, you've changed the habitat. Now let's look more closely at some of these effects with increased solar radiation because of the lack of litter and reflectance of solar radiation, and now and also a black surface, at least for a while, that's really good at absorbing, has a low albedo, and so it absorbs a lot of that solar radiation. There's a tremendous amount of increased energy availability for these new plants as they come back from the fire, because there's absolutely no litter in the way. They're in 100% sunlight, increased energy for the plants then. We can see that during the first 30 days of the growing season, that PAR, which is photosynthetic active radiation, just a way of saying visible light. Visible light's what's used by plants for photosynthesis. That's almost 60% higher. That's also going to increase the temperature in the soil. And that's a hugely important factor for a number of reasons, because the soil is absorbing much more solar radiation. The temperature goes up, and that means that two important things happen. The plant roots that are in the soil can begin doing respiration sooner and have a higher respiration rate. And that's a necessity, of course, for root growth to occur. That's going to help increase the amount of vegetative growth and the root to shoot ratio, which is, again, the amount of biomass of root relative to the amount of shoots. And another very important thing, which is really important in terms of the sort of the amount of growth that can happen, is the increased amount of microbial respiration. In other words, microbes get more active. Bacteria, fungi, protozoans, all of the microbial food web organisms that are down there in the soil, they get more active because of the increased temperature. And that increases mineralization, which is basically a fancy way of saying the decomposition of organic matter and the release of nutrients. That's a very important outcome in terms of the nutrient availability. Now, another thing that happens, and I put a couple of slides here just to impress upon you how much difference there is, again, between a plot that's been burned and a plot that's not been burned for several years, and the amount of thatch and litter that can happen there, or that can be there. And this is an important one in terms of moisture, and it can be a little bit complex in some ways, but One thing that has been shown, and it makes sense when you think about it, if you look at these two plots and it rains, say we get a nice gentle rain of, a half inch or so, all that water is going to go right to the soil here. It's going to increase soil moisture. Not all of that water is going to go to the soil here. This litter is going to intercept a lot of that water, a lot of that rain, and it's going to get soaked up. I mean, that litter is going to soak up water. Any water that litter soaks up is never going to get to the soil because it gets soaked up by the dead biomass, by the litter, and then the only way it leaves that is through evaporation. So that's important because, as it says here, in burn plots, then there's considerably higher amount of soil moisture early in the growing season that coincides with the exact same time when there's also higher light. Those two things coinciding together are going to be two factors that contribute together in terms of the amount of growth then that plants can have. Another very important thing that comes about because of this interception of water is the nitrate. Nitrate, one of the most important sources, natural sources of nitrate or nitrogen to an ecosystem, especially a grassland ecosystem, is the amount of nitrate that's naturally dissolved in the rain. This is nitrate that comes about because of lightning happening in the air and converting nitrogen gas to nitrate. That nitrate, of course, is a nutrient that plants can pick up. It gets into the ecosystem again by dissolving into that rain that's falling. And then if that rain enters the soil, the nitrate enters the soil. But if that rain is intercepted by litter, like on the right side here, the nitrate in the rain intercepted by litter, that nitrate's going to get assimilated by microbes that are in that litter. That nitrogen is not going to get to the soil until those microbes die. And then it's not sure, how much of that will actually get to the soil. So that's an important factor in terms of the nitrogen. Now, this all depends on rainfall intensity to some extent, because litter, again, has this ability to be both something that prevents water from getting to the soil, as just described, but it can also, on the other hand, in terms of the water that does get to the soil, it can help retain it there because that litter is going to help reduce evaporation from the soil. So how much of this is happening in either way depends somewhat on rainfall intensity. The greater the amount of rain and the more intense the rain, of course, the more of that rain is going to get through the litter and get down to the soil. But if you're having just, light rainfalls of a half inch to 3/4 of an inch or something like that, then I think there will be a considerable amount of interception. What people have seen is that if you look at soil moisture at the end of the growing season, we will see that things have been reversed. Late season moisture will be less on this burned area than over here. And again, part of that is due to the fact that the mulch over here might be helping to conserve whatever moisture or protect that moisture from evaporation. But the real reason is most likely related to the fact that over here, the reason there's less soil moisture is because there's simply been more growth over here. If you look at the amount of biomass between these two plots, a lot of people have, and I've done it myself, the amount of growth over here, the productivity can be twice the amount of over here. Twice the amount of growth. If it has twice the amount of growth, it's had twice the amount of transpiration. It's taken twice the amount of water out of the soil and transpired it to the atmosphere in order to produce that growth. So that's really more a consequence of the higher productivity here. I will say that research has shown that if you're dealing with short grass or mid-grass prairie and Loess Hills and further to the west into the Great Plains and western Great Plains into eastern Colorado, then things really get much different with fire ecology, especially with what we've been talking about here. Fire out there may actually limit productivity more so than enhance it. It definitely enhances it in the tall grass prairie, but again, where it's drier, where it's naturally drier, then that relationship gets more complicated. I'm not going to stay on this too much, but you have it in the handout. This is actually a figure from the paper that talks all about all of this stuff, the Knapp and Seedstedt paper. You can find that certainly online. It's a really good paper. It talks about all of this stuff, and it puts it into the context, though, of how litter, and so you see this layer of detritus here, layer of litter, how that limits the productivity of tallgrass prairie. So if you burn that away, you know, then you're taking that limitation away and you get a lot more growth, which has been seen many, many times. Another thing that can happen, I mentioned convective cooling and leaf morphology. The more open environment that happens again, if you can think about those two slides I just had there with the burned area and the unburned area, the burned area has a lot more openness, and so those little plants, as they're coming up after the burn, they have a lot more convective cooling available to them. Their leaf temperatures can be maintained at a lower leaf temperature because of convective cooling. That helps them to have a leaf temperature in a range that's more optimum for photosynthesis. And it's going to also help lower the amount of evapotranspiration, because the leaf temperature is going to have a really big role in terms of how much vapor pressure there is in the leaf, and again, how much vapor pressure then there is to leave the leaf. The amount of vapor pressure that would be in the leaf versus the amount of vapor pressure in the air, that's the gradient that drives transpiration, the loss of water from leaves. And so anytime the leaves get warmer, transpiration goes up. So again, this is going to counter that by keeping those leaf temperatures lower by convective cooling. Another kind of interesting thing that happens is, again, think about those two pictures I just had there. And again, plants coming up in the burned area, they're in the sun from the get-go. Those are going to produce sun leaf morphology right from the get-go. But those plants that are coming up through that mulch of litter, those plants are struggling because they're not getting as much sun, of course. They're struggling, fighting their way through that litter. They will fight their way through that litter. But as they are producing their leaves within that layer of litter, they're going to produce shade leaves. They're going to produce leaves that look a little bit different. So here's some of just the basic characteristics between a sun leaf. Just think of this as a sun leaf, and this as a shade leaf. And there's some really important differences in terms of morphology and chlorophyll and all kinds of things I don't have time to go into. But the point of this is that if you're in a sun leaf environment from the beginning, you're going to be in the sun as you continue to grow, such as the case for a plant coming up in the burn area, you're going to have the right morphology for the environment you're in all the way through the growing season. But if you're one of those plants coming up in that layer of thatch and litter, and you develop shade leaves, because that's what you're in at the time, you're in shade, so the leaves do develop shade leaf characteristics, and that's good. That's helpful for them at that point of time. But that plant's going to continue to elongate, and those shade leaves are going to come above the litter, and now those shade leaves are in a sun environment. And now they're not the right leaf to have the most maximum photosynthesis and efficiency. And that can also be a factor then that decreases the productivity. So again, this figure from the same article is, again, the source of that information that you can check out if you want. By the way, if you want a copy of that paper and you can't find it, I've got copies I can send to you. A little bit more on the nutrient environment, because this is really important. Because there's this fallacy out there in the tallgrass prairie that when you burn the prairie, you have the ash that results is a fertilizer that helps to increase the productivity, which we see almost all the time. That is not supported for tallgrass prairie. That would be true for a forest ecosystem, and that's because in a forest ecosystem, there are a lot of nutrients locked up in that wood. We're talking about hundreds of years of nutrients being locked up in wood, that when a tree dies, yes, it starts to decompose and some of those nutrients start coming out, but a log decomposing on its own is going to take another 100 years. If fire comes through, that's rapid decomposition. And so those nutrients in those logs are released right away. So there is an ash effect in forest ecosystems, but not for tallgrass prairie, because in a tallgrass prairie, the soil has way more nutrients in it than the ash that you get from the fire. And so there is no ash fertilizer effect. In a tall grass prairie, the important sources of nutrients, the increased nutrients that do happen to increase the growth, are not coming from the ash. It's coming from that mineralization, the increased decomposition of organic matter. It's coming from increased nitrogen fixation because those legumes are growing more vigorously in this better environment. And it's coming from that rain through fall. Now, another thing that can happen in terms of nutrient availability is fires almost always increase the pH because there's cations in the ash that are released, and that's going to increase the pH a bit. That, again, doesn't have really any effect because of a fertilizer effect, but it can affect nutrient availability because the pH has a strong effect on which nutrients are soluble and are available to pick up. And it's also, of course, likely true that some of those elements could be toxic compounds too. So the solubility of both good and bad elements is affected by the pH. Another thing that Dr. Tiffany at Iowa State proved one time looking at pathogens before on burned and unburned plots is that, like you might expect, fire is going to decrease the amount of plant pathogens, fungal spores, viruses, bacteria, because they'll just get consumed by the heat and the flames. And so one reason plants again can grow better and more vigorously is because there's less disease. And this is an important one here. Fire, again, showing that there is more efficiency in nutrient cycling. Because of the increased growth that the fire has basically spurred on, again, as I said, up to twice the amount of growth, production of biomass is what I'm talking about. There is a lot more nitrogen uptake. And so that means less nitrogen sitting in the soil and potentially leaching to the groundwater, because plants are picking up all the nitrogen that they can. They're picking it up and retaining it in the ecosystem rather than letting it get leached. So fire can be very positive there. So let's talk about the 3 rules for burning. Rule number 1, I preach this all the time. I mean, I see people, talking about, oh, it's time to go out and do the burn. And if I were standing next to them, I'd ask them, okay, but why? Why are you going to burn? What's your goal with burning? We don't burn just because it's fun to burn, or someone else told us, oh, it's time to burn. We always burn on April 15th. That's the way we've always done it in the past, and that's the way we're going to do it, right? No, you burn because you have an ecological reason for doing so. And if you can't express a reason for burning, then I don't think you should be lighting fires. Number 2, the factors that affect and characterize fire, and this is partly as a disturbance factor, magnitude, that's talking about the amount of force, basically, the intensity, the amount of mortality that might be caused by the fire, sort of the level of the loss of biological legacy. So how big and forceful is the fire? The extent is how much area it covers. And the seasonality, of course, is when during the growing season does it occur. That last one is by far the most important, I think, in terms of the ecology, because when you burn is going to be really important to think about in terms of what the effects are going to be, which plant species, again, you're going to, or animal species, you're going to have an effect on. And that's the last part here then is we always have to remember that fire is inherently very destructive. Organisms will die. Anytime you light a fire and burn a fire, you're going to kill something. There'll be something out there you're going to kill. And so you have to balance the application of fire with the occurrence of refugia, places where organisms that are totally susceptible to fire. Again, I'm talking about native things. The bad stuff we always want to die, of course, right? But the native things that are supposed to be out there that have evolved in a fire system, have evolved in a climate and fire environment, Those are the things that we have to be more watchful and careful of, because again, we have fire now working in a landscape that's not like it was 200 years ago. So if you want to know why you might burn, here are several reasons why you might burn. Cause mortality or stress to woody invading populations. That's a fairly common reason to burn because we have plenty of those problems. Likewise, cause mortality or stress to non-native cool season perennial grasses, another very common problem. Brome, as we see here. But again, when you do this, it's helpful to think about, well, when is the best time to do this? It's not the same time for both of these species. Smooth brome would be the second week of May or so. And well, you can probably kill a cedar about any time. So I might have to reverse that. But if you're talking about woody vegetation other than cedars, hardwoods that are capable of resprouting, cedar is very susceptible to fire. So you can kill it pretty much any time as long as you can consume it. But other things, again, hardwoods, deciduous trees that can resprout, that's going to be more like in August, the best time to do that. And then this is one that you might be able to express. You actually want to cause some stress to some of those native grasses because you got a situation where there's just way too many of them. Something went wrong in a reconstruction or something went wrong on a remnant, and there's way more native grass abundance and vigor than is needed, which probably is having some effect on the forb diversity because grasses are very competitive. So if you want to try to increase native forbs, one way would be to push back on the native grasses. You'll see an example of that on the last slide. What else? Another reason, of course, cause mortality to other invasive forbs, but all of these then are going to require thoughtful application of when it is the best time to do that. You have to think about that in terms of their phenology, when they're most susceptible to fire, but you also have to think about it in terms of, again, the flammability of the vegetation. Can you get a fire to go through there? It gets complicated. You could always say that your goal for the fire is simply to increase the productivity of that ecosystem, to increase the growth of those primary producers, to get better forage quality for feeding bison or feeding elk or feeding cattle or feeding deer, to get greater seed production, to feed small mammals, to feed birds, to get more flower production, to feed butterflies. One thing a fire would do very clearly is it will produce a trophic cascade, a bottom-up trophic cascade. Because if you're producing greater plant growth, primary production is enhanced by twice, that's going to mean everybody else in the ecosystem that depends on plants or depends on somebody who eats plants or somebody in that line up that trophic level, all are going to benefit. You can also say that you want to burn because you want to enhance seed dispersal and seed germination. Seed dispersal certainly could be enhanced because of the higher plant height that will result, the more vigor of that plant growth, and especially in terms of things that get dispersed from a plant, the taller that plant is, the farther the seed can get away. It's also been shown very clearly that fire helps to increase myrmecory, which is the dispersal of seeds by ants. In a burned environment, ants are able to forage farther, apparently. I have to look at this paper again and get the mechanism, but we have a lot of ants in prairies, of course. And so increased seed dispersal would be likely a result there. The other three things are increase in seed germination. Now, again, this could be a good thing if you're getting plants that you planted in a reconstruction, perhaps, and getting them to germinate finally if they haven't germinated yet, or even in a native remnant, if getting some of the seedling germination going to replace plants that maybe some of the adult plants are starting to die back. Or it could be a negative thing if you're getting invasive non-native species coming out of seed bank, but it will clearly increase seed germination. The three mechanisms mainly is just simply the light being more conducive to seed germination, That is something that's measured by the phytochrome system in plants. And again, don't have time to go into details, but the phytochrome system is the way that plants recognize whether or not there is light, basically, present. A way a seed recognizes whether there's light at the soil surface or whether there's shade at the soil surface. How far down into, and also how far down into the soil it is, because the seed may be buried too deep to germinate successfully. Obviously, seed germination can be enhanced with scarification. That comes about because of heat, again, the breaking down of the seed coat that then will allow germination to happen. And there's also evidence that smoke can induce germination. It's thought this happens basically because of chemicals that come from the smoke get leached into the soil and have some effect there. Chemicals that leach into the soil, again, help to again, they get imbibed by ungerminated seed, then tell the seed that it's time to grow. I want to put this in more as a rule again, just limit the negative effects of mortality. So again, this idea about allowing for the presence of refugia. And this can happen about in different ways. One, the most surefire way, of course, is taking your landscape unit, your prairie that you're working on, and cut it into, 3 or 4 sections or something like that, and only burning one of those at one time, leaving some large percentage of it in unburned condition. But, this really happened probably to some extent naturally with lightning-caused fires that were burning in the late part of the growing season because of the slightly less flammability of the vegetation then. It's likely that with the amount of green vegetation present, fires would have burned in a more patchy way. This is kind of what's happening in this picture here. Here you're getting refugia being built into the actual burn area. Places, patches of vegetation that don't burn for whatever reason, because they're just a little bit too damp or the flame intensity isn't enough, they're a little bit too green, those sorts of things. And the last thing is you could also express the reason to burn if you just simply want to recreate the same exact conditions that created the prairies and savannas and woodlands that we have, because all of those species, again, have evolved in some kind of fire regime. And so that means, again, they are adapted to fire in some way that non-native plants are not adapted. And it makes great sense to me to think about the fact that we can use that difference, and we should be using it probably more than we are, to help separate out who the prairie and savanna and woodland species are, who the real ones are, and who the invasives are. Generally, they did not evolve with fire. So there we go. A little bit over, sorry about that. Here is a video of a late August burn I did on my place to accomplish those goals right there, trying to push back on basically just a warm season grass. Whoops. Trying to push back on the grass so I could get it ready for an interseeding of forbs. All right, are there any questions?
Yeah, we do got a couple in the chat.
A lot to absorb in a short amount of time, but you've got the handout you can always go back and look at.
There was one sort of early on, somebody asked that you could repeat the number for the amount that you said for the prairie biomass.
Oh, so the effect on prairie biomass versus burn and unburn?
I think so.
I think so, that's what it sounds like. So this has been studied a lot, in a lot of situations, a lot of contexts. It's almost always been studied. Well, I'm sure there are studies that deviate from this, but the most standard way of this was doing a spring burn. So people do a spring burn in April or so at the beginning of the growing season, and then have burned and unburned plots, and then at the end of the growing season or during the growing season. I mean, you can do it during the growing season, but really it's the end of the growing season is what really counts. The end of the growing season, you go out there and you clip plots and you measure the amount of growth that occurred during that growing season. And most studies will show upwards of twice the amount of productivity on a burn plot versus an unburned plot. Twice as much, or 150% is more, something like that. But always more.
Thank you.
So we typically do prescribed fires in spring. Is that really the most natural way would it be better to mimic the midsummer lightning caused fires?
Okay, that's a very good question. I'm glad someone asked that. Because you might take home a message that I'm saying that we should be doing burning, when lightning caused fires cause fire, which has been happening for millions of years. And that, of course, is the way that the tallgrass prairie system evolved, has been evolving for 7 million years or more. But again, we're not dealing with the same situation now. If you had a remnant that didn't have any invasives in it, then there would be maybe more reason to think about growing season burns, just to mimic again the natural way that prairie evolved. But you see, that's not the way it is. We have huge problems with invasive non-native grasses: brome, fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, timothy, name the list. If you want to try to use fire to help you deal with those species, then you do have to modify, this thinking, because you have to burn when they're most susceptible, when they're going to be damaged by the heat and the flames the most, when you're going to incur the most negative effect on those species. And a lot of research has shown for brome, and I've done some myself, that is clearly the second week of May. Basically, they say when the brome is in the fourth or fifth, I think, leaf stage. Some of the leaves are still in boot stage, but basically you can think about it when brome plants are maybe about, maybe 8 to 10 inches or so in height. That's a stage when the brome is starting to, it's got leaves forming. It's formed some leaves that they're still going to come out yet to start doing photosynthesis. And so you're kind of hitting it right before it gets that photosynthetic edge. It's put energy into making the leaves, but it hasn't got any payback yet because those leaves aren't completely functional yet. But the leaves have been formed down inside the sheath. Lots of studies have shown that. I have a study I could share with you that has shown that is a really effective time to have see a decrease in the amount of brome. For other cool season species, it might vary a little bit. I suspect Kentucky bluegrass is similar. Some work I've done suggests that actually for tall fescue, the best time for a fire to have a negative effect on that is probably in the fall. And I think the reason there is because it's a different species. It's again non-native, but it's cool season, of course, and non-native, so it's similar to brome in that way. But it comes from a different place. It evolved in a different place, and it's a little tougher grass too. It's definitely a tougher grass. That's why people use it in pastures as a forage grass. I think what happens with, and this is just a hunch, and what I've seen is not strong data, but I've seen data that sort of hints or points that a fall burn might be more effective on tall fescue. And I think there the situation is it stays green into the fall quite a ways, quite a long time, even longer than what smooth brome. And so you hit it in the fall, and if it's early enough in the fall, it'll stress it out some, because now, of course, you're going to top kill it, and it's not able to do photosynthesis until it gets cold. When it gets cold, freezing temperatures consistently, is going to die back. But you weaken it in the fall, because it's, I would burn sometime probably in October, but you weaken it in the fall before it goes dormant. And then the weaker situation, the weaker condition that the tall fescue is in because of that fall burn is one of the factors that, combined with, and this you'd have to just hope for this, but a cold, stressful winter, that's going to be a stressful factor on the grass too. And so the combination of a tougher winter and the fact that the grass is going into that tougher winter in a reduced vigor stage, in a weakened stage, that could be the reason for more mortality then over the winter. And so you'll see in the spring, the next growing season, a bit less tall fescue. My point here again is that no, burning in July and August, although that's the time when nature burned in terms of the evolution of prairie, now we have to be much more thoughtful because we're dealing with non-native species that have gotten a hold, and we're dealing with ecosystems that, again, in many cases, there's a large amount of what I call negative resilience. This is resilience, again, in the ecosystem, but it's bad resilience because we've got potentially so much invasive stuff out there occupying the space, occupying the biomass. And it's just going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of stress to get rid of, you know, a lot of fescue or a lot of reed canary or a lot of buckthorn. Those systems that have a lot of that stuff have a lot of negative resilience. So you have to think about, again, what your goal is. Which species are you going to try to affect? And in most cases, it may not be July or August. I mean, if you were to burn a prairie that has a smooth brome problem in August, you would probably actually be helping it more. Helping the brome more than you'd be having a negative effect on it, because you're going to hurt the native grasses more than you're going to hurt the brome. And that brome will come back in the cool temperatures of the fall, probably much stronger then. And I've seen the same thing happen with people who were burned too early in the spring. They go out and burn in March, maybe be the first one out there and get started with your burn season and burn in March. And I've got data that shows clearly if you burn in March, you're going to increase the amount of brome and Kentucky bluegrass, because you're basically helping it begin its growth. You're paving the way for the brome and the bluegrass to have, you know, this open, highly productive environment. It's you have to think that, you know, it's true that, of course, brome, again, and other species evolved in a northern European, northern Asian environment where fire may not have been very common. But the fact that they're still a perennial grass gives them a certain amount of protection from fire. And so just because something's non-native doesn't mean that if you burn it at some point in time, that it's going to disappear, because it's not that easy.
Thank you for that.
Sure, you're welcome.
We have a couple more questions about timing. So one of them is there a best time if you want to promote forbs?
Well, I think, you know, almost because forbs cover a huge range of phenology. There's forbs that are blooming and growing and active in April or even a little bit earlier. The early spring, and then the early summer, and then the midsummer, and then the late summer, and then the fall. It would just depend upon, again, which of those phenologies you're trying to help. Usually, if you want to try to promote one of those more, you would try to burn right before it begins its growth. So if you knew that, you know, species X was going to begin growth in 1st of June or so, coming up from the root system, again, their meristematic tissue starts to get active enough to get growing, like maybe baptisia or something. If you were to burn, you know, middle of May or so, that would probably be excellent for it, because you've cleared everything away. Your plant that you want to help is not up yet, so it didn't get top killed. It was protected by the soil, but you cleared all the competition away, and you made this great environment now with lots of sun, lots of water, soil moisture. And so now when it begins growth, it's going to like it. That's one of the things about burning in early May to hurt brome, is that that's about when the native grasses start coming up. So one thing that really happens there that's helpful is that the brome's been up for probably, you know, several weeks. So it's got a lot of growth. It's used energy from the root system to grow, but now you're coming and you're going to top kill it, set it back. It loses that energy basically that it put into the growth those 3 weeks. And so, but it'll come back. There's not been one study yet where someone burned and the brome was all gone. Not one study yet like that. The study that I did, I saw the density of brome go down by about half. So good progress, but there's still brome there. And it's going to come back from the root system. It's a perennial. But what happens when it comes back from the root system now in May is that it's coming back at a time when the native warm season grasses, if you've got some there, are going to be much better competitors. See, when that brome began to grow 3 weeks earlier, the native grasses were not competitive because they hadn't started any growth yet. They're later. So that's one thing about cool season grasses that's gives them an edge. Their earlier phenology just kind of works to their great advantage in a prairie because they naturally begin growth ahead of even some of the native cool season grasses, but certainly the native warm season grasses. But by burning it and forcing it to come back now at a time when the native grasses are beginning to grow, you get another factor that's going to stress that brome. Now it's a competitive factor. It's the native grasses being better effective competitors on that brome with much better root systems than the shallow root system that brome has. And that can be, again, a factor that helps to see brome, again, decrease even more as you go into the growing season.
Okay, we've got a couple questions. One is asking about to decrease Coreopsis tripteris, and another one is to set back Lespedeza cuneata. So the timing on those.
The timing for Coreopsis tripteris?
Yeah.
To help it, basically?
No. Set it back.
Oh, set it back. Ooh.
Kill it.
Set it back. Well, that can get pretty big, so I wouldn't wait too long. I'd probably, if you could carry a fire through it once it gets to about, 10, 12 inches or so, maybe a little bit bigger. That here is sort of, you want to try to let it exhaust as much of its root system as it can, and then you come in and top kill it. So if you wait too long, it's just going to start producing more food, and you're not going to gain much then. So you kind of want to, like with the brome, with any plant, you want to try and hurt it. You'd want to try to burn it when it's sort of at its peak physiological time period, when it's really, doing a lot of photosynthesis. That's often right before flowering, or even a little bit earlier, again, thinking more in the line, well, as soon as it's got its leaves out and it's starting to show, multiple leaves, two or three or four leaves at least, burning it then, so that you have a better stress factor on that plant. Because again, waiting is just going to allow it to put more food down in the root system. So, of course, some of that food that's being made by those leaves is going to go into continued growth too. So, I would say basically anywhere from a week to a couple of weeks before flowering probably would be a good general rule to try to have as much stress on it as you can.
And the other one was about Lespedeza.
And then the other one's about Lespedeza. So Lespedeza, you're not probably going to have much luck with fire on Lespedeza. I mean, you can certainly try. Again, burning it as it's just coming up. Again, maybe about 5-6 inches or so. The idea is that you're going to top kill it. And so what you're going to have to realize, though, of course, is that it's going to come back. So you can use the fire anytime. You can use fire at least once, anytime, to be one top killing if you have enough fuel. And again, you'd always want to try and time that top killing, the use of fire, when it will, have maybe the most negative impact on that species. Again, always factoring in the idea, though, that if you let too much green growth occur, then you may not get any fire at all. Because again, it's always going to be in relationship to how much litter you have and how much growth, green growth there is. Now you saw in that fire I was doing in August, there wasn't any problem carrying a fire through that mostly warm season grass in August. There was a couple years worth of litter probably in there at least, so that helped. And of course, the other thing about July and August that's really good is that usually the humidity is really low at that time. So even if biomass is green, you can often still get it to burn because the relative humidity is, down like, 20, 30% or something, or even lower. But I mean, I always want to caution you, if you're trying to hit Lespedeza, you could have this idea of when maybe you have to be watching it, and you're watching its growth, you're watching how much litter there is, how much green growth there is of Lespedeza, but also all the other plants too. And so, you're going to have to burn before it gets too green, of course. And if you get a good fire through there again, and it doesn't take a lot of heat to top kill those plants. I mean, you don't have to have, flames that are, 3 to 5 feet high or anything like that. You saw again, that burn I was doing there at my place, that was a back burn. And that would be the other thing, using a back burn too would be helpful, because that will usually put more heat on those plants. So you could always use it once to top kill, but Lespedeza is going to come back. And so what your strategy there would be, now you go back out and you top kill it again, if you can, with a brush cutter or something. I mean, if you got a lot of it, that, you'd have to use a mower, I suppose, or use an herbicide. You come back and use that. The strategy I was using on that burn I was doing in August was I was using the heat of the flame and the fire to cause some stress on the native grasses, because it was August, and again, they're starting to go into they're starting to make flowers, or are making flowers, maybe starting to make some seeds. So that again, that's going to be a stressful time, sort of at their physiological peak, when they're trying to do the most growth there and allocating energy to flowers and seeds. And I did see an effect there, because the blue stem and Indian grass barely came back. By November or so, when it's when it's getting cold enough that you don't expect anything really to grow anymore, late October, there was just a little bit of growth, like a centimeter or so of grass growth. So it looked like that it had worked in some ways in terms of stressing those grasses. But I also wanted to top kill bird's foot trefoil and make it regrow again from the root system. And then the plan was, well, I didn't do it that year, because I actually wanted to see if fire could have an effect on it all by itself, and it doesn't. It came back to next year just as strong as ever. But what I realized now would have been the right thing to do is just go out there and spray it then in the fall after it came back, because then you really have a good situation for spraying something like that, because you can easily get a foliar spray on the leaves. There's no litter in the way. And the bird's foot, again, it was coming back more substantially than anything else because of the time of the year. We're talking now September or so, when the spraying would have been done. So again, I think it's advantageous to use fire as a way of sort of preparing an herbicide application. And that's what you'd have to do that with Sericea lespedeza, because that's a very tough plant to get rid of. Probably repeated top killings, even spraying it, you might have to come back again the next year and do another top killing somehow.
Okay, the last question is, when do you seed relative to the burning, before or after?
Planting seed.
Yep.
In the context I was talking about on my place there with the interseeding, I guess.
Yeah, or maybe
So,
just in
is
general.
that person still here? Can you just clarify? I want to make sure I'm answering the right question.
Yeah.
Maybe they're not here anymore, huh? Well, so what I was doing there at my place, I was going to interseed in the dormant season. What I scattered forb seed out there in February of the following year. So I burned it in August. Got hopefully some weakened the grasses at least somewhat. Wanted to weaken them enough so that there was at least less vigorous growth of them the next year, so that there's more open space for seedlings of forbs to grow. So yeah, I put the seeds out there in February, and I have to say it's looking good. I'm getting lots of everything I planted pretty much. Lots of Lespedeza, lots of Dahlia, a lot of Asteraceae stuff. But I mowed it too. So when you try to interseed a bad reconstruction, that's dominated by warm season grasses, I think using fire in August is going to help. But another thing I did was I cut the site, mowed the site with a rotary mower, about middle of the summer or so, to again keep the height of the grasses down so that more sunlight was getting to the soil. Usually if you're going to interseed into an existing prairie, interseed forbs into existing prairie, you're going to have to do some mowing. That's been shown pretty well in some research that Tallgrass Prairie Center did. But if you're just going to talk about burning to prepare a site for seeding, if you're going to do a planting, you can certainly use burning to do that too, to help prepare a site for seeding. If you're going to, if you want to do a dormant season seeding, then you'd have to burn sometime in the fall, probably. You have to burn when you can still burn. If you're going to do a seeding in May or something, then of course you could burn it in April or something like that, or pretty much right before you scatter the seed out. Burning, fire could be used pretty helpful. Fire is pretty helpful in trying to prepare a site for seeding. Certainly, you can use it to help push back on cool season grasses. Anytime you burn, you're going to increase the germination of whatever's in the seed bank. So again, that can be a way to help prepare a site for seeding by doing that in a way that does pull seed out of the seed bank, seed of invasive or non-native species, and then you simply, take care of those by not letting them go to seed. And especially if you're dealing with annual, biennial species, you would be effectively reducing the amount of seed present on that site. Quick story, that's exactly what was done many years ago. And as a grad student at Iowa State, and Ames High Prairie, which is also known as Pole Prairie Preserve, was more or less being managed by just a group of people in Ames. It had a very bad sweet clover problem on the south facing slope, and that's some of the best prairie there. And so we decided, a group of us decided, well, let's just go in and burn it in March. And the idea of burning in March was, the purpose of that burn was to increase the seed germination of sweet clover. We know there's going to be seed in the seed bank, and so let's increase the germination of sweet clover, burn it in March. And it definitely worked. We got lots of sweet clover coming up. And then that was all first year plants. And I think we probably were out there, and if there were any plants that tried to flower, we took care of those. But generally, most of those plants, would not be flowering the first year. It's a biennial. But anytime you say biennial, though, a biennial can sometimes be an annual, or it can sometimes be a perennial too. But for the most part, most of that sweet clover was behaving as a biennial, and so it just grew as a vegetative plant that year. And then the next year, we went in and we did a burn, because we had some fuel, of course, at that year that it grew. The next year, we went in and did a burn the early part of May. And by doing a burn early part of May, we got the second year plants as they were coming back up. And this was going to be their second year of growth, the year that they flower and produce seed and then die. We used the fire to kill them. So they didn't produce seed. didn't produce flowers. And so in a sense, again, what happened there was we got a whole bunch of sweet clover seed out of the seed bank. And that site doesn't have any sweet clover in it now at all.
All right, I think that's all we got for now.
All right. Well, again, glad you stopped in tonight. And next week it's ferns. All right.
Thanks, Tom.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Welcome.
See ya.
Bye.